During the 1930s, a small group of ambitious men and women wanted to change the lives of ordinary people radically. These idealists were architects who'd brought modernist architecture to Britain. From small beginnings, these buildings would spawn a high-rise landscape and rehouse 4 million people after the war. But in 1968, a gas explosion ripped apart Ronan Point, a tower block in East London, and the British modernist dream was shattered. As the 70s opened, the modernist vision of a world made better by architecture was distorted by the reality of the system-built tower block. Modernist architects protested they were innocent of the disaster at Ronan Point, but the public pronounced them guilty anyway. After the outcry, very little new building was commissioned. The only high-rise projects being built were those already underway when tragedy struck at Ronan Point. A new generation was now living in the hundreds of thousands of homes that the modernists and local authority architects had built. But this was a generation that couldn't remember the war or how bad things had been in the slums. The social climate was beginning to change. In the early 50s, Alison and Peter Smithson had won worldwide architectural acclaim when they'd built the very first modernist secondary school from industrial materials. Now, in the district of Poplar in East London, they were building a new experimental housing project, only too aware of the shift in attitudes.
At the turn of the century, architects dreamed of garden cities. Simple, clean, sun-giving architecture. What we have now is people living in these clean, sun-drenched boxes with fitted carpets inside and vandalism outside.
Society at the moment asks architects to build these new homes for them. But maybe we should only be asked to repair the roofs and add the odd bathroom to the old industrial houses and just leave people where they are to smash it up in complete abandon and happiness so that nobody has to worry about it anymore.
Architecture was in chaos. The pioneering modernist designs in the 40s and 50s had given way to mass-produced, poor-quality, local authority-designed estates, and the modernists were carrying the can. They were seen to be destroying communities and even putting people's lives at risk. The backlash against the modern movement was in full swing. The Smithsons' Robin Hood Gardens experimental design may have been questionable, but at least it was solidly built. Just across the road from here, less than a mile from Ronan Point, one modernist architect was making a defiant stand 27 stories up. Erno Goldfinger, a Hungarian émigré, was spending some time living on the top floor of his most recent building, Balfron Tower, when the explosion at Ronan Point happened. Goldfinger believed that the high-rise still offered the perfect solution to housing needs. But Balfron Tower was just a prototype. In West London, Goldfinger had already started on an even taller high-rise, one that would, in coming decades, become the most famous symbol of Britain's modernist urban architecture. Trellick Tower stands 31 stories high amidst a North Kensington estate designed entirely by Goldfinger. It was started in 1966 and took 6 years to build. Like Balfron before it, this huge building is actually two completely separate structures. The larger is the accommodation block, made up of over 200 apartments, and the narrower tower contains the services, including the lifts and the rubbish chutes. From a distance, Trellick looks like a monumental slab, but the closer you get, the more elegant it appears. In fact, for a building of this height, it's incredibly slender. And Goldfinger's love of things military is evident in the service tower, where the arrow-slit windows look chaotic, but in fact are perfectly ordered, like the building itself. What's the joy of living in Trellick Tower?
Well, I mean, from standing on this perspective on the balcony, you've got light we've got space, and we've got these beautiful materials. I mean, if you look at this here, you've got Goldfinger's favourite type of aggregate concrete, which looks rather like a beach, or as he said, like the edge of a pyramid. And then you've got this cedar wood panelling, which could do with a varnish, but apart from that, it's just a beautiful wooden material.
And what was the idea of the stable door?
Well, I think the idea there is was the kitchen through here, and I think the idea is that when you're cooking, you can watch your children playing on the balcony. It's a very substantial balcony, and you can sit out on it to have your meal, and that you can cook, you get the smells out, you can watch the children playing, and you can just sort of move out to eat, really.
So in a sense, the balcony is an extension of the living room, and it makes it seem like a total
Well, that's
space.
why when people come into the flat, they always think that the living room is enormous, because if you look at it, about a third of the space is actually balcony. And of course, the glazing in this flat, because it's set this way, is the whole length of the wall.
Within the tower, there are 6 different designs of flats, ranging from 1 to 3 bedrooms.
So this flat was for how many people, or designed for how many people?
This was designed for 6 people. That would have been the standard at that time. It's 3 bedrooms, so ideally there should be 4 children and 2 adults, because Goldfinger, of course, was one of the few architects who really believed that it would be a good idea to have children high for the fresh air, for the light and so on, and getting away from all the troubles on the ground. The amazing thing is that he managed to have every single flat with a view both ways. Even 1-bedroom flats have a kitchen that looks onto the corridor with a window. And neatly opposite it on the access corridor is another window. So every flat in the block is as wide as the block, so to speak, and looks both ways. And a certain number of flats at this end also have the view then over London.
On every 3rd floor, there's a corridor containing the front doors for 3 levels of flats. Despite its massive 31 stories, there are only 10 public corridors, and the 2 lifts need only 10 stops, reducing the building to a much more human scale.
Each floor has got a different colour tile. There are 10 of these.
So you know if you're on your right floor.
If you come back drunk or something, you know, the idea was you could come out of the lift and say, oh, that's the wrong colour or something like that. I know that I'm this particular blue.
Goldfinger designed other parts of the building to echo the modern day. In an attempt to make them more familiar and less daunting, the 10 floating walkways between the 2 towers were modelled on the exact shape and size of intercity train carriages.
Because the block and the service tower move at different rates in the wind and so on, you can't actually have them attached or it would crack.
So in fact,
it's cantilevered out from this side, and it's suspended on neoprene, which is a synthetic rubber. So it's almost floating. There's nothing underneath us here.
Goldfinger couldn't have picked a worse time to complete Trellick. The press, now keen to seize on any negative association with high-rise living, unfairly appropriated the tower as an icon of a disintegrating society.
For people who lived here, I think there's a sense that it's actually worked consistently throughout. It hasn't had a down period and an up period in the big sort of drama sloganising way that it's been suggested. I think people felt that it worked from the outset and that it's continued to do that.
For Goldfinger, Trellick wasn't nearly high enough, but he never got another chance. Trellick Tower was British modernism's last stand. Too much had gone wrong and the high-rise had fallen out of favour. This was the headstone on the grave of the modern movement.
The oil crisis of 1973 heralded the start of a slow collapse of confidence in centrally planned big government, the sponsors of much modernist architecture since the war. Strikes, unemployment and recession meant little was now being built, modernist or not. But the period also marked the slow decline of architects from heroes to villains. The election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 brought about a new market-led economic regime. Local authorities cut costs and the maintenance of big housing schemes suffered. Boom and bust, fast money and riots replaced the old social certainties. Modern life and modern housing was failing.
What do you think about the flats? What do you think they should be?
Stick a bomb under them.
Public pressure resulted in the demolition of some of the worst public housing schemes barely a decade after they'd been built. As the recession eased, architects, now almost universally criticised, were being kept busy by the commercial sector.
And as we came out of the recession, what architecture came out of the recession too?
Well, I think we look back on it as commercial architecture, mainly offices, and it was partly getting the maximum value out of a site. The more you could cram on the site, the more money you could make, basically. And the lower the ceiling heights were, and the sort of cheaper the materials, the more money you could make.
Modernism and its social vision had now become a distant dream, and few public buildings were being commissioned. But in the early 1980s, the National Gallery ran a competition to build an extension to their Victorian building in London's Trafalgar Square. Many ideas were submitted, but in 1984, the leading design drew the attention of an unlikely critic. At a presentation organised by the Royal Institute of British Architects, Prince Charles launched an attack on that design that rocked the establishment.
But this was the assembled ranks of, in a sense, British modernism as well, sitting in front of the Prince.
It was half probably international modernists, and not only modernists, distinguished architects, and half guests and developers and all sorts of people, all of whom were not expecting a monologue on what they were doing wrong. It was going to be a great jolly, a terrific evening, wonderful place to have it, and suddenly it became a bit of a disaster.
What then are we doing to our capital city now? What have we done to it since the bombing during the war? What are we shortly going to do to one of its most famous areas, Trafalgar Square? Instead of designing an extension to the elegant facade of the National Gallery, which complements it and continues the concept of columns and domes, it looks as if we may be presented with a kind of vast municipal fire station, complete with a sort of tower that contains the sun. I would understand better this type of high-tech approach if you demolished the whole of Trafalgar Square and started again, with a single architect responsible for the entire layout. But what is proposed seems to me like a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much loved and elegant friend.
When the word carbuncle sounded, was there a kind of intake of breath?
It was a pretty fierce word for what he was talking about. The whole speech was a bit over the top.
What do you think was the impact of Prince Charles's speech on you and on other architects like you?
Well, I think what Prince Charles did was to raise the public's awareness of architecture in a very, very big way. And there's no question about that. And that, in a way, can do nothing but good.
He did create architecture as a dinner party topic, which was quite good. In fact, at that time, I was sitting next to a most entertaining woman journalist, and she told me all about her work, which was fascinating. And then she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm an architect." And she turned to have a good look at me and she said, "Really? Aren't you bitterly ashamed?"
When the extension to the National Gallery was finally built, it reflected a new style that had crossed the Atlantic. In America too, modernism had run into trouble. The response was postmodernism, not a movement, but a style of decoration, bright colours and a sense of fun.
How did we get postmodernism?
Most of those buildings were fairly straightforward, functional buildings with pieces of cosmetic material just tacked onto them. Bits of column, bits of decoration, bits of colour. In some cases, bits that even fell off. So you were trying to make something look better just by pure cosmetic treatment. It was a pretty kind of superficial approach to doing things, really.
But was the idea that the public would feel more comfortable with something that wasn't quite, as it were, brutal, that it actually had reference points the public could understand?
Well, that was the apology for it, really, that if you stuck a couple of columns on the front, people would feel more secure, and it would remind them in some way of the Parthenon. I mean, I think the psychology was as shallow as that, really.
Despite these efforts to appease, the public remained largely hostile to anything modern. Then, in 1987, the voice of the people delivered a final blow.
In one of the most outspoken speeches ever made by a member of the royal family, Prince Charles has said architects have done more damage to British cities than the German bombers during the Second World War. At a meeting of planners and developers at Mansion House in London last night, he said, "When the Luftwaffe knocked down our buildings, it didn't replace them with anything more offensive than rubble. We did that."
In 1988, the Conservative government put an end to public spending on new housing. Any chance architects had for pursuing modernist ideals in public housing were gone. Now the economic boom afforded architects a different opportunity. Big business wanted big buildings. A monumentalist approach to architecture dominated the 90s. Amidst the economic resurgence, technology was leading the way. A commercial, ultra-high-rise glass and steel skyline was reaching higher than ever before. But as the millennium drew to an end, other buildings were showing that some of the fresh thinking and aesthetics that modernism had inspired could be popular again. When Peckham Library opened here in South London, it was quickly recognised that this was a public building which caught the imagination and drew people to it, offering them something very new.
When you first got the chance to do this, what was your first
Oh God. I mean, no, I was interested. I was very excited in getting this opportunity because clearly Peckham isn't the best place in the world, and it's an opportunity to work in a place with problems and to see what you could do. Second thing was, what is a library? There are not many new libraries built today, and therefore it was an opportunity to think, how could you extend the use? I was very worried about the little shops just behind the bus over there, which are now behind scaffolding, that if you put a building on the ground here, you disenfranchise the shop. So I wanted to make this another sort of gateway, a covered courtyard, and then to come through with this very thin building so that you get light penetrating all the way through these lower floors. So in a way, it just had to be L-shaped.
The thin ground floor offers a one-stop shop for the local council and lifts up to the main part of the structure, the 2 floors of the library itself. The north side of the building is made up of panels of coloured glass that bathe the spaces in warm tinted light when the sun shines. Strange pods sit around the building. These serve as private spaces, cubicle areas to escape to.
And we'd already said that Peckham was a bit depressing at that time. So by putting coloured glass panels, particularly when we go to the children's library, you can look out and you can see Peckham through normal transparent glass, then you can see it through rose-coloured spectacles and yellow, and kids do that, and I like it.
And then the pods, which are a recurring theme of the building.
Well, the whole thing about pods that I like is that they take up space, but they actually still leave quite a space around them. As you can see here, you can walk all the way around it, you can go inside it, and yet, and it's an interesting form. So it's much better than building just a wall to make another room.
This seems to refer more to art than architecture.
Well, I take that as a compliment. I mean, I spent 8 years teaching sculpture, and therefore it's in my blood, and I do spend a lot of time painting. So I tend not to make the distinction between art and architecture. To me, it's the same sort of activity.
In your view, what has changed for architecture in the last 10 years?
One of the things I think that has changed, sounds a bit glib, I think people love us more. Tremendous help, and very important to be loved. So that sounds a bit simple, but on the other hand, I think that what has changed is that new architects, or good new architects, can produce extraordinary things that people want to go to and enjoy. The only criticism I've had of this one is from people saying you didn't make it big enough because there are too many people in it. Well, the original figures were something like 12,000 a month, and it now does 38 to 40,000 a month, you see, so it is too small.
It works. How do you describe your own architecture?
Well, I've come back in the last 2 or 3 years thinking that I'm actually a modernist, and it's an extension of modernism. Because if you say that modernism isn't a style, it's a way of life, and it's to do with the quality of life, health, delight, joy, all of those things, which of course it was originally. Therefore, that's exactly the same things as I'm trying to achieve in the buildings that I do. Therefore, I'm a modernist, I'm not a stylist.
British modernism has left a legacy of memorable and influential public buildings. And because of the part the movement played in the post-war housing programme, the terrible problems of the slums are hopefully a thing of the past. But new problems have arisen. In some places, especially in London, property is prohibitively expensive. Many people can no longer afford a home.
If Will Alsop is a new modernist, what about some of his contemporaries? The ideas that inspired the early British modernists, light, space, nature and technology, are at the heart of new plans for the future.
The architects behind one of the country's most popular attractions, the London Eye, are working on a housing project that could make a huge contribution to London's modern-day housing needs. It's a scheme that draws heavily on lessons learned from the history of domestic modernism. Julia Barfield and David Marks want to build 15 new high-rise accommodation towers alongside the Dome, amidst a specially created park on the Greenwich Peninsula. These towers are called sky houses.
So, is the view your inspiration?
Well, it is. I mean, you just have to look around you now at the views here. I mean, this could be a view from a sky house. You know, imagine living with this, waking up to this, going to sleep with this.
Everybody enjoys a good view, whether it's the top of a building or the top of a mountain. Yeah, I imagine waking up, seeing the sunrise or watching the sunset. It's fantastic.
But it's different being in a pod for 30 minutes than actually spending 20 years of your house on the 18th floor. No, you're in a sense stuck with the view. I mean, how are you so sure people want to live high?
Well, I mean, the market shows you that people want to live high. All these office buildings up and down the Thames, not all of them, but a good number of them are being converted into very, very expensive apartments to buy or to rent.
If it goes ahead, the Sky House project will provide homes for 14,000 people. They'll be mixed tenure, and crucially, it's the commercial sales of homes that will subsidise cheaper accommodation on the site.
We've built 3,000 tower blocks in this country, most of them hugely unpopular because they were built very, very fast, and that's the thing that most people forget. All the technical and construction problems we have are really a result of a political decision to build them fast.
So what would the experience of living in a sky house be?
Well, I mean, what we're proposing is that every 10 floors you would have communal spaces, we call them sky lobbies, and that might be a mini park, it might be a nursery, it might be a leisure facility of some sort.
It's community meeting place.
Yes.
It seems that these were the needs that the modernists were addressing 50 years ago,
yes.
That they're still the same needs.
Yeah, and the same needs now, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. I mean, we all want the same sorts of things. We want somewhere safe and comfortable to live, somewhere where we can bring up our children, somewhere we can meet other people, somewhere we can live life and enjoy it.
But if not that, then what sort of buildings do we want to live in the future? There are other options.
When the Dorset market town of Dorchester needed to build new housing, heritage was the new concern. The land to the west of the town was owned by the Prince of Wales, and he agreed to the new estate, called Poundbury, on the condition that he'd be directly involved in its architecture and construction.
This was Prince Charles's reply to the modernists, what he calls traditional urbanism. Here in Poundbury, he made concrete his belief that if you consistently deny the past is relevant to the present, then man eventually loses not only his roots, but his soul. What we have here is by and large what? A tiny bit of 17th, mainly 18th and 19th century references. Is it rooted anywhere, or is it just a variety of architectural traditions from that period?
Well, it's really very much in locality. I mean, the idea of Poundbury was very much to try and create something on the edge of Dorchester that would sit in its location, that would have numerous reference points to the historic city of Dorchester, and would also sit in the landscape, the surrounding landscape, so that, as the Prince of Wales said at the beginning of the process, if you stand on the top of Maiden Castle, you can look down over Poundbury, and you don't ask the question when it's finished, why on earth did they build that plot on the landscape?
The Prince says that he is against modernism, but for the modern.
Yeah.
But there's nothing here that is modern.
Well, I think there's a lot here that's modern. I mean, all the homes are built to very modern standards. They're thermally very efficient. There are very modern principles here in terms of people being able to walk to work without using their cars. There are very modern principles here about low-income households being knitted into the community with people who are perhaps more affluent, can afford to buy their homes.
I mean, you have myriad architectural references, but in this house here, you also have blanked up windows. I mean, that's about the window tax.
Well, it was about the window tax.
That started before the 1700s. Isn't that taking it a bit far? I mean, you may as well not have internal sanitation here as well, then.
Well, I think it's very difficult because, one criticism of Poundbury is that, there's too much uniformity in terms of its architectural references. They're all too historic. Another one, and I think you're referring to it here, is that there's too much trickery going on. There's too much eclecticism. And that might not be to everyone's taste, but someone at some time has bought it. All I see someone at this time is selling it. Be interesting to see how they get on.
You could buy it.
Modernism in the 20th century has largely been about rejecting tradition as much as reinventing the future. And I think Poundbury, in a sense, may not be to everyone's taste, but it's about re-establishing those connections between building traditions, urban planning traditions, and architectural traditions.
Every house in Poundbury is a monument to the past. Altogether, they're almost overwhelming. How can we have confidence in architects to look to the future if they're obsessed with recreating what's gone before?
Architecture is an evolutionary process, and so is its appreciation. It takes decades for public architectural taste to shift. The listing of buildings was introduced in 1950 to protect older architecture, some of which was widely disliked when it was built. Now, many modernist buildings are also listed to protect them from hasty demolition, and once again, public opinion is changing. These are buildings that people are beginning to love. The first British modernist housing project, Wellscoats Flats in Lawn Road, is Grade 1 listed, the same level of protection afforded Buckingham Palace. And it now has a new future. It's to be redeveloped as desperately needed affordable housing for key workers. The very first post-war modernist building listed for its architectural importance now stands above
a simple and beautiful modern entrance behind a locked gate in Bethnal Green. Dennis Lasdon's cluster block Keeling House was built in 1957, trashed during the late 80s, and lay derelict and unloved for 5 years in the 90s. Now it's been reborn.
But the council tenants have long gone. British modernism was effectively killed off by the changing political climate and the weight of public opinion. But the housing market of today has given some of the buildings a new lease of life. The renovation and sale of Keeling House is a success, and these 4 towers now contain 66 new flats, including 8 rooftop penthouses.
Okay, now here we have the first bedroom. As you see, there's a lovely balcony there. Now, that's great for breakfast out on the balcony, I think.
God, the view's fantastic,
yes, isn't it just? You can see Canary Wharf, the Millennium Dome.
This is a completely different space than it was originally.
Yes, there was a wall running across here, and there were bedrooms. And as you see, we've got a lovely, well-equipped kitchen here, the fridge freezer.
On mod cons. This was added on to the original Lasdon block.
That's correct, yes.
So how much would a penthouse cost here?
310,000. Can we interest you in one?
Wrong city.
Oh.